My name is Eduardo Esparza. I am the founder and CEO of Blue Dot Project and the host of the Climate Evers podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into the stories of entrepreneurs and changemakers who play a critical role in valuing and supporting the Earth's natural capital. Here we acknowledge that nature provides critical services to modern society like water, regulating our climate, and making land inhabitable. But we take nature's services for granted, depleting it faster than the Earth can naturally regenerate. So if the current system values nature more dead than alive, then we need to change the system. We need economic models, businesses, and policies that properly value our planet's natural capital. In this podcast, we talk with entrepreneurs and heroes changing the system from within. We go deep into their personal stories, inspirations, and unique approaches. Together, we unravel what it truly takes to shift the system into one that secures a brighter, more abundant, and sustainable future that supports all life on Earth. Now let's meet today's host and their guest. Today's episode, we have Benjamin Casteillo. Benjamin is founder and director of New World Together. He's an ex-senior manager and expert consultant in systems and organizations, now using his analytical skills to solve the existential risks humanity faces in the 21st century. Benjamin is fully dedicated to developing and sharing a human-centered transdisciplinary approach to help catalyze a sustainable transition. Thanks for joining us, Benjamin.
Hi, Eduardo. Thanks for having me.
How do you get started in this path? How do you go from handling consulting projects in a capitalistic world and now ending up in a mission to shifting mindsets and behaviors globally?
I felt that I was kind of forced into the educational system. It wasn't really my values. It was the values that I had to follow in order to get a diploma and to get a good job and follow the requirements that society was asking me to have. And very early in that process, I felt that something was wrong. Already as a teenager, I started to feel that the way we function is not sustainable, or in other words, self-destructive. And then I started to connect it with the reports of climate change or deforestation. And as a young guy, I didn't know what to do with this because I was asked to have good marks in school, to get a job, to have a professional career. So I basically tried not to think about it. As a young adult, I wanted to travel the world. So I started to study international business because there was international in it and it felt like a good way to travel the world. I entered the corporate world. And in that world, I quickly realized that we were mainly focused on profits and growth. And I could see that we had very little care for the ecological or social consequences of our choices in these corporations. I started to connect the dots between that and an increasing number of reports pointing toward mass extinction, climate change, growing inequalities. And so I started to realize that I was part of a major problem and that this gut feeling of humanity is heading towards self-extinction was becoming much more tangible. I still couldn't put it into words at the time, but what I could feel was a lot of cognitive dissonance and discomfort. And so I remember swapping from states of feeling really depressed because I'm looking at the state of the world, and states where I feel like I'm fine, but I'm in denial. Basically, I'm just ignoring all these aspects and I'm focusing on my job and the money I'm making and the status I'm having and everything that comes with it. And with the time, that cognitive dissonance became more and more difficult to deal with. And so I had to make a choice. Either I was continuing on that path, continuing on my corporate career, which was really rewarding in a way, or I was going to take my responsibility and do something about this trajectory that we had taken toward catastrophe. Doing the second was stepping into unknown territory. I was too disturbed at the time. I went to a meditative retreat trying to find inner peace. And basically the meditative retreat opened an entirely new dimension to me, which was inner focus about mechanism and potentials that I had never known about before. And so I carried on that path. It was a journey of realization, peeling layers and layers of unconsciousness. And somewhere on the journey, I came up to create a New World Together, which is dedicated to bring forward those human solutions to catalyze the sustainable transition.
Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the New World Together.
So the idea of a New World Together is to do research education using a transdisciplinary approach and is really to catalyze the sustainable transition through the awakening and expansion of human consciousness. What I discovered along the journey is that the sustainability crisis that we are facing is caused by human patterns, and that these patterns are unconscious patterns. And if we want to change them, we first need to bring them to a level of awareness. And that's one of the major aims of New World Together, is to bring the collective patterns that are unsustainable and unconscious to the surface so that they can be acknowledged and recalibrated.
Got it. Understood. Very good. Well, let's deep dive into that because that's a super interesting subject and something the world needs to know. We hit the planetary overshoot day exactly 6 days ago, July 28th, I believe. And that means we consumed all of the resources our planet has a capacity to regenerate this year. So today and every day until the end of the year, we'll be depleting the stock of natural capital at a rate that it will just not regenerate naturally. And you have dedicated your organization to finding the root causes of this problem. And tell us a little bit about your findings. And let's do a deep dive into those patterns you have found.
Sure. So basically here we are speaking about the overexploitation of our planetary ecosystem. It's a logical result of the current dominant patterns of human beings, which is about competition for short-term profits, unlimited accumulation of capital, and growth. So right now, that's how we function. That's how our economic model functions. It's based on competition of all economic actors for growth, basically. And so this cannot be sustainable on a finite planet. We should have realized that a long time ago, but we haven't, because we have nurtured and grounded economic theories that are based on the belief that every resource is replaceable at will, and that therefore we do not need to care about limits, which is of course wrong. Why we are functioning this way? We have to understand that this has been a pattern of survival for our ancestors. The paradigm of our ancestors was a paradigm of scarcity. Basically, the norm was to not have enough. And so in that paradigm, they've learned to produce and accumulate always more, and to decide that the more they were producing, accumulating, and consuming, the better it was. And so we created an entire global economy based on that paradigm, based on these values, an economy based on GDP growth. And it was never designed to integrate our planetary limits. What happened is that we entered the Anthropocene, the era in which humans dominate the surface of the globe, and today have access to an exponential technological progress. And in this era, this pattern of survival is becoming increasingly obsolete and self-destructive. The problem is that this pattern is not something we do consciously. It's something that is embedded in our unconscious. It's automated within us. The dominant belief until now is that this is part of unchangeable human nature. What we found is that's actually untrue. It's not part of unchangeable human nature. It's primal mechanism of survival that have become predominant in the course of history, and that are deeply rooted within the collective unconscious. And what's perpetuating this mechanism is basically belief systems, fears, and traumas that are collective and intergenerational, and that belong to a bygone past. The situation of scarcity that ancestors have faced was traumatic. There was experiences of extreme poverty, of famines, and that is a collective trauma. What the collective trauma of scarcity does, as long as it is unresolved, it perpetuates a state of existential anxiety. In that case, the fear of not having enough. And that fear of not having enough generates impulses to accumulate always more that are rationalized by the belief that to have more is necessarily better. And that way of functioning that is unconscious is absolutely not fit for purpose in our time. And of course, very incompatible with the need to recognize and integrate planetary needs. Now, the problem is that we have an entire economic system and an entire society established on this primal survival instinct.
these behaviors that you're describing, drive to neutralize the threats, need to accumulate resources, and the need to fit in socially, these are the same characteristics of a chimpanzee colony, right? And they are ruled by the same behaviors. If this is so embedded in our nature, what leads you to believe that these are actually learned behaviors and not so deeply embedded that can't be changed?
So first of all, I noticed that there's a cultural aspect to it. Many indigenous tribes, for example, don't run on the need to have always more. They've learned to live in symbiosis by nature. And it's based on their culture, based on their value, based on their beliefs. So to say that this is innate to all human beings is already wrong. Now, what needs to be understood here is that the tribes that were best at dominating and controlling their environment, at accumulating resources, and at creating social norms that conform individuals are the ones who colonize the rest of the world. In that case, we're speaking about my ancestors. They were mainly from Western Europe. And so it's convenient for us to say that, oh, this is unchangeable human nature, because then we do not have to ask ourselves questions and basically ask ourselves, what are we doing? I see that some communities have learned to live in peace with one another. They are not embedded in rivalry for power. And some individuals have learned to self-realize and express themselves as they are. So those are not patterns that are unchangeable. They are simply patterns that stem out of unconscious mechanisms. I also can say out of my personal experiences, I was running on these patterns before and I couldn't see any way to change them. Following my own personal journey of consciousness awakening and consciousness expansion, I see that I can regain control of these patterns and recalibrate them. Of course, it's progressive. It's not something that I do just as a mental will. It requires me to go inward and to notably process the traumas, the fears, and the limiting beliefs on which these mechanisms are established. I don't see that these patterns are unchangeable. I simply see that we haven't yet brought them to a level of awareness. And therefore, they have been impossible to change.
Awareness is the beginning of the path, but then I found myself also in the same patterns that you described, where you're probably aware of the problem, but suddenly you just decide to take the blue pill and just continue the world and not worry about this thing, hoping that somebody else takes care of it. And then how do you cope with the actual intrinsic fear in society of scarcity? If I lose my job today, I may be on the streets tomorrow because the landlord may kick me out. That is a fear that paralyzes a lot of people. It used to paralyze me when I used to have a day job, and probably you as well when you were employed. Yeah, just the thought of stepping out of that comfort zone and going into the unbeaten path, it's frightening.
You mentioned rightly that the first step is being conscious, and not only of the problem outside of us, but the root cause inside of us. Because otherwise, we are only able to do symptom treatment. Then for me, start the journey of integration. The journey of integration is exactly what you're describing. It's about healing those traumas, releasing those fears, and deconstructing these limiting beliefs. If we don't go through the journey of integration, well, we have awareness, we have consciousness, but we are not really able to act accordingly. We live in disalignment because we are not able to embody it. So the journey of integration is key. And part of the journey of integration is to release this fear. I would say this requires discernment, because it's not just, oh, I'm not going to fear scarcity, so I'm not going to care about my bills and things like this. No, because society still is established on scarcity. We have to be really aware of what are the fears that we can let go in order to untap our ability to embody change, and the fears that we need to keep because they are structuring. It takes experience. I don't have a miracle solution. It's personal for each and everyone. We are all in different situations. Once you're able to embody this new consciousness and the change that is needed, I believe that opportunities will come. Society is in the process of realizing that it has taken a path towards self-destruction. And it's also in the process of realizing that technology won't save us. Technological solutions won't be sufficient to achieve sustainable transition. We are starting to realize it collectively. So I believe that in a relatively short future, the type of initiative that I am driving will be recognized and valued by society, which means that it will be much easier to get financially supported so that we can live out of the contribution that we are bringing towards society.
So yeah, you're suggesting to address the inner fear of scarcity with some sort of safety net. The indigenous communities that you described have a personal experience with in Africa. They live in tribes. There's many people, many parents of the children, so that the children never actually lose their parents. In one interview, someone asked, yeah, are you afraid of if your father's not here one day? I cannot lose 20 dads. Basically was the answer. In our modern society, basically the family is isolated. And so the insurances you need to drive that sense of safety, the bar is a lot higher. So you need a lot of savings. You need to think about those sort of insurance products so that in case you become disabled or anything, I mean, there's a lot to build. And it takes years of enslavement to get that level of abundance and say, okay, I have enough. Now I can take the next step and I can actually act on my awareness. Is there any alternative to act sooner?
I think it's hard to define a rule that fits all, but I think you mentioned one of the keys to know when we have enough, and then to start reorienting your resources toward the change that we need to become a sustainable species. For me, the key is through inner work. It's to not only be focused on the outside, but to also be focused on the inside. And if that fear is not released, then we are stuck in patterns of accumulation. We are seeing a pattern of addiction to have always more. These patterns are actually resulting in the overexploitation of our ecosystem and the destruction of our future. What do we see behind an addiction is an existential anxiety and an unresolved trauma. We are basically trying to compensate on the outside what we are not having on the inside. This feeling of fulfillment, this feeling of peace that can make us feel like we have enough.
What makes some people more open to this first step of awareness? Is there certain characteristics? For instance, it's very common that this concept or state of enlightenment doesn't ever exit someone's mind once they have tasted a little bit of it. The second point is in the systems thinking primer, Donella Meadows makes a hierarchy of levers to change the system. And the highest above all the other ones is the transcending paradigms. But it's really super hard to do. So how do you go about unpacking these findings that you're getting to and make them accessible?
That's still a question I'm working on responding to, but I can give you elements. I think first is really key to vulgarize. I hope I'm doing it well enough, because what I'm sharing with you is a vulgarization of very complex notions, which involve advanced psychology, sociology, anthropology, history. And so I think the key is to vulgarize it, to make it accessible. Also to show the advantages of looking at these parts of ourselves that we have denied, this part of reality that we have escaped until now. I think right now, if I look at environmental movement or people who are caring about the sustainability crisis, very often the tone is very catastrophic. To me, when I look at the inner aspects of the crisis, I am much more hopeful and faithful about our collective ability to overcome this challenge. But to do so, we need the courage to face ourselves and the parts of ourselves that we have repressed until now.
This is a question of leadership also. Leaders have a huge role in adopting this kind of awareness first, because others will follow. But leaders are, in a way, the most trapped beings because they are subject to the results of GDP or growth or whatever, although they have the leadership and the influence over others. Is there a point of intervention that you have identified, perhaps?
At some point, we will need a change of leadership, because as long as we have leaders who are focused on how fast is growing their economy and how much social status they have, then we won't have a shift of paradigm. Now, if we want to change of leadership collectively, we need to embrace new values. The leaders that we elect are based on our collective values. They are the reflection of our collective values. So unless we change collectively our values, then we won't have new leadership. How do we change collectively our values? Well, we start at the individual level. We start to integrate and embody new values so that they become accessible to others, and so that more start to embrace them as well. That doesn't mean that that way is a guarantee of success. But what is sure is that if no one takes that way, then we have a guarantee of failure. I think the leadership right now is also about the courage to embrace and embody these values, even if they are not shared by the vast majority of people around us and by our society. And so that means stepping out of the norm and follow what we know is right and needed for the human species.
It makes me think of something that I find very frightening. We have all this new wave of clean tech entrepreneurs and the green economy and all these things. A lot of these new companies claiming to be doing something great are built on the same paradigm of infinite growth. I'll take the example of Tesla. Okay, they're uncertainly, moving to electric vehicles is a step in the right direction, you could argue, but it's still built on the same paradigm of accumulation, same paradigm of exploitation. There is not really a shift in the system in any significant way. We have clear examples of systems, blockchain, you have Web 3.0, that are truly built on a new set of values and operating in a new model. What can we do to get these new values embedded in business models?
One of the main reasons why we are not coming with the right solutions is that we haven't yet defined the problem properly. Today, most people believe that the problem we are facing is climate change. It's as if someone is suffering from a fever and we're like, okay, well, there's a body temperature increase, so we're just going to get an ice bath and everything will be fine. So we haven't defined the real problem. Climate change is just a symptom of the problem. The problem is with the pattern of competition for unlimited accumulation of resources. And so this is an effort we have to do in communication to bring awareness on what actually is the problem and to differentiate it from what is a symptom of the problem among others. There are other factors of unsustainability, such as growing inequalities, constantly increasing financial debts, out of control inflation, geopolitical tensions, cultural norms based on consumerism, etc., etc. As long as we poorly define the problem, we can't expect to come up with realistic solutions.
Defining the problem is always 95% of the path to the solution. You have mentioned a couple of concepts that I was trying to find here. If you could define it for our audience, please. You mentioned transdisciplinary and transpersonal. What does those mean?
Transdisciplinary means you combine different subjects, different disciplines that are relevant to address a problem in order to extract a new knowledge that is specifically designed to resolve that problem. Transpersonal means that you take in consideration the self and the interrelation between the self and everything else around. So we used to believe that we were all separated and living in a mechanical universe that doesn't make sense. But what we are learning now through quantum physics is that everything is interdependent and interrelated in our universe. There's not one element fundamentally separated from the other. We cannot understand or resolve one problem if we don't understand its interrelation with everything else.
Self-realization is hard enough. So although certain states of peace and love tend to be contagious, one state of mind really is influencing the surroundings. Is this practically how you go from one to the many? Is this a process of osmosis in a way?
Every realization that humanity had went through this process. At first, people were believing the planet was flat, and then we had individuals that realized that it was actually a globe. Then little by little, this realization became more and more common. Society change starts with individual change, and vice versa. They are interrelated with one another. Where we often are trapped is that we would like something instant and guaranteed. That's not going to work. What we can only do is make the change we want to see in the world, to integrate and embody it, and then help others to do so. The rest is not up to us. It's a process that takes time and which we need to accept. But I think today, the crisis of sustainability that we are facing as a species or as a civilization is inviting us to it. It's simply a collective state of denial and escapism of the situation.
I want to transition to another concept that you mentioned in your research. You talk about the regenerative transition cycle as a key to transition into a conscious, symbiotic, thriving species. What is the regenerative transition cycle? And perhaps walk us through it.
Different people have different way to describe what's a regenerative transition. I will explain how I see it related to ourselves, what it means for us and for what's happening inside of us. A collective regenerative transition will mean that we as a species have achieved the needed level of collective intelligence, of collective consciousness, in order to start that process on a planetary scale. It means that we are working on treating the collective trauma that we have not treated yet. We are helping ourselves and one another release the collective fears that are not serving us anymore, to deconstruct the beliefs that belong to a bygone past and that are not compatible with our reality. There's a lot of therapy going on all over the surface of the globe because we have acknowledged that we were not functioning the way we were supposed to function. We were functioning in a traumatic stress. The human species has been through centuries of wars, of invasions, of genocides, centuries of famines, of severe deprivations, colonization, slavery, etc., etc. These have been experienced by the entire human species to some extent. These traumatic experiences, they don't go away like that. They are embedded in our beliefs, they are embedded in our culture, in our society, and they will perpetuate patterns associated with the trauma that we've experienced. No, this is not a curse for the human species. It's a blessing. Because what we know is that when we heal our trauma, we go through a process of post-traumatic growth. And what does post-traumatic growth generate? Is an expansion of human consciousness. It means we expand our level of self-awareness, we expand our level of knowledge, we expand our level of empathy, we expand our level of discernment, we expand our level of creativity. And so this expansion of consciousness is exactly what is needed at a collective level to untap the potential for a sustainable transition. A key part of the sustainable transition is that regenerative transition.
The next concept you have, also super interesting. You're advocating for a different characterization of our species from Homo sapiens to Homo conscious. As a great philosopher Immanuel Kant described the subject, we're destined to see the world from a selfish perspective just because we really see the world in technicolor from our own perspective, and we cannot possibly see it in any other way. So we will never truly be able to see the tree for where it is, fundamentally, because you're not the tree. And your idea of the tree is not the tree either. How can you possibly expand into Homo conscious when this idea of separateness seems to be part of who we are?
So first of all, I will just rephrase what you just said. I don't think we see the world from a necessarily selfish perspective, but we see it from a subjective perspective. My way of seeing the world is very unique, and it will never be your way. Basically, our perspective of reality are all subjective, relative, and limited. Reality is very multidimensional. I will consider it infinite, absolute, and objective. So our perspectives are not supposed to be put in confrontation with one another. They are supposed to be complementary to one another. Becoming an Homo conscious is recognizing our subjectivity, our limitation, our relativity in a multidimensional, infinite, absolute, objective reality. Homo sapiens lacks self-awareness. He thinks, but he doesn't really know who he is. He's mainly driven by unconscious patterns. He's not aware that he's driven by unconscious patterns. It's just following the norms and trying to survive and make the best out of it. Homo conscious, on the other way, is aware of himself, is aware of his unconscious patterns, is able to recalibrate them when necessary. He's aware of his creative power, which means that he can deconstruct and upgrade a belief when it's necessary. He's aware that he's the creator of his society. There's a major difference between the two. Sapiens is mainly unconscious and unconscious of his unconsciousness. Conscious is mainly conscious and conscious of his unconsciousness.
There's this vivid example of Plato's cave. The cave has gotten a lot bigger over the years. There's a lot more shadows in it that we can perceive as reality. We seem to have more and more awareness, but it still is the cave. Is this what you characterize as dysfunctional cognition?
One of the cognitive dysfunction that we have is this confusion between the relative and the absolute. If we truly realize our place in the universe, we realize that we are always relative. There's no objectivity. So once we realize that, we are being asked to be a little bit more humble and to not think that because we have, for example, a book that we consider holy, we have a universal truth. Because we've been able to make some measures and get some data, we have some kind of objectivity. Here we are being called to embrace a reality that is far beyond what we can perceive and to remain individually and collectively humble about our perception and open to aspects of our reality that we may have not acknowledged or interpreted well until now. To achieve the sustainable transition, we are asked for profound change, to reinvent ourselves. And we won't reinvent ourselves if we don't have the knowledge needed and the courage to deconstruct our own beliefs. Because very often part of the strengths of the Plato's caves or of the cognitive cage in which we are stuck is that we are very often identified with our beliefs. So for example, if I was to be very religious, for me to deconstruct my religion, I would see it as a threat for my existence, which is actually completely untrue. It's simply a change of my belief, an evolution of my beliefs. There's no rational threat. It's actually an evolutionary step if I do that. I think here there's a major evolutionary step for the human species, which has the power to resolve a lot of conflicts and to allow us to take a major step forward in terms of knowledge, because we will simply realize that the beliefs and the perspective that we oppose to one another until now are actually complementary. But they can only be brought together if we remove the dogmas and the illusions that are attached with them.
As a result of this process of transition and moving into the Homo conscious, which makes me think of the Overman of Nietzsche, this is ultimately the right path. However, will we have enough time to make this transition?
I understand a lot of people would love to have certainty, but there's no certainty. Right now, we are playing a game. If we were certain to win the game, it wouldn't be an interesting game. It would be a boring game. So we are not certain to win this game. The universe is not going to give us that evolution. We're going to have to go for it. And that's conscious evolution we're speaking about. It's not something that's going to happen automatically. We're going to have to consciously seek it. So I don't know if we're going to win or if we're going to lose. The game is on. If we don't play it, we will lose it.
What's your advice for people creating companies now?
I would say if you create a company, just be very aware that you're just not creating a company. You're also shaping your future identity, because that company is going to determine the way you think, how you present yourself to the world, how you behave. And so be very mindful and concerned about who you want to become in the first place. And then be very mindful and concerned about how is this person that you want to become compatible with a sustainable human species. And so the sustainable transition requires all types of solutions. See which one resonates for you, which one is really talking to your heart and allowing you to become that best version of your authentic self.
When you're creating something, expand the boundaries of your creation in the concept. So the call to action really is think who you're going to become as an entrepreneur or as an investor supporting that company. And also what impact is that company having, or what impact are you having on others? So a couple more questions regarding how can someone engage with New World Together?
So right now I'm working in groups. I'm also working one-on-one with people who are taking my online programs. So you can get in touch with me through our website, newworldtogether.com.
Are you ready for the rapid five?
Yeah, sure. Let's go.
All right. Benjamin, top author or book?
Well, one that I want to read right now is The Myth of Normal from Gabor Mate, who's bringing a lot of light on the interconnection between our unresolved traumas, our collective addictions, and our current system of society.
What climate leader do you look up to or inspires you?
I don't understand the climate leader thing. I think we suffer from climate tunnel vision. We need less climate leader and we need more people with a systemic and global approach.
Does anybody fit the bill right now?
I have some people who inspire me. Gabor Mate is one of them. There's Arthur Keller in France with the systemic thinking. There's Thomas Ribal with collective trauma awareness and collective trauma healing.
All right. So if you had a magic wand, what would be one thing you will change or problem you'll fix today?
Nothing at all. Because I think all the problems that we are having are there as challenges for us to overcome, to become more conscious of the species.
Who do you think we need to have in the podcast?
Arthur Keller, Thomas Ribal, Gabor Mate, definitely those people. I think they need more voice.
I think we answered the fifth one a little bit earlier, but do you think we'll make it?
Games on.
Games on. All right, Benjamin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Eduardo, and I hope this was insightful for you and for your community.